April 14th, 1865. Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C., 10:15 at night. The Civil War is over. Just 6 days earlier, General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. 4 years of the bloodiest conflict in American history had finally ended. Abraham Lincoln, exhausted to his bones but in genuinely good spirits, sits in the presidential box watching a comedy called Our American Cousin. He is laughing. Behind him, a door opens. John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor who knows this theater better than his own home, raises a single-shot .44 caliber Derringer and fires it into the back of the president's head from 4 feet away. Lincoln slumps forward. He is carried across the street to a boarding house, laid diagonally across a bed too small for his 6'4" frame, and declared unlikely to survive the night. He dies at 7:22 the following morning. But what if Booth's pistol misfired? What if Lincoln, who had changed his plans many times that week and almost didn't go at all, simply stayed home? What if the most important man in America on the most important night in a generation had lived to see the morning? The answer is one of the most consequential what-ifs in all of human history. Here is what you need to understand about the moment Lincoln died. The Civil War had ended, but the harder question, what kind of country America would become in its aftermath, had barely begun. 4 million people had just been freed from slavery. 11 southern states lay in ruins, and the political battle over who would control Reconstruction and on what terms was the central fight of the era. Lincoln had a plan. He had been thinking about it for years. Just 41 days before his assassination, he stood at his second inauguration and laid out his vision in words that became some of the most famous in American history. He called for healing the nation with malice toward none and charity for all. His 10% plan was built on that same principle. Once 10% of a southern state's 1860 voters swore loyalty to the Union, that state could begin rebuilding and send representatives back to Congress. It was lenient by the standards of his own party. It was designed to bring the South back quickly, without humiliation, without prolonged military occupation, without breeding the deep resentment that punishing a defeated people always produces. Lincoln was not naive about the freed slaves. He had evolved dramatically on the question of black civil rights throughout the war, further, faster than almost any white politician of his era. In the last speech of his life, delivered just 3 days before he was shot, he publicly endorsed voting rights for black men who had served in the Union Army. It was the first time an American president had ever said such a thing out loud. In the crowd that day, listening, was John Wilkes Booth. He turned to a companion and said it meant citizenship for black Americans. Then he said, "That is the last speech he will ever give." So what does a living Lincoln do with that power, the most popular man in America, the savior of the Union, armed with enormous political capital and a clear vision of what he wanted? He fights the radical Republicans. This is the part the history books skip over. Lincoln's own party had a powerful faction, men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, who wanted to treat the South as conquered territory, impose military rule for years, and remake Southern society from the ground up. They despised Lincoln's lenient approach. They had already tried to pass their own, far harsher Reconstruction bill, which Lincoln pocket vetoed. The tension between Lincoln and the radical Republicans was one of the defining political conflicts of the era. Here is the brutal irony. Booth's bullet ended that conflict by removing Lincoln from the board. The man who replaced him was Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat from Tennessee, a committed white supremacist who had only been placed on the ticket as a gesture of national unity. Johnson's Reconstruction was a catastrophe for black Americans. He returned confiscated land to former Confederate slaveholders. He allowed Southern states to pass black codes of laws that effectively re-enslaved the freed people in all but name, restricting where they could live, what work they could do, whether they could travel, whether they could testify in court. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act. He fought the 14th Amendment. He was eventually impeached, missing removal from office by a single Senate vote. None of that happens with Lincoln alive. A living Lincoln almost certainly signs the Civil Rights Act. He supports the Freedmen's Bureau, which at its peak had 900 agents across 11 southern states, providing food, shelter, education, and legal protection to formerly enslaved people. He almost certainly does not return the land. He uses his enormous credibility with both Northern moderates and ordinary Southern whites. Former Confederate soldiers had come to view Lincoln as the South's best friend in Washington to build a political coalition that Johnson could never have assembled. Columbia University historian Eric Foner, one of the foremost experts on Reconstruction, put the point precisely. The contrast between Lincoln and Johnson, he argued, reminds us of how much one individual can matter. The 14th and 15th Amendments, which guaranteed citizenship and voting rights for black Americans, grew out of a very specific set of circumstances created by Johnson's behavior. Johnson was so bad, so reactionary, so openly racist, that he united the Republican Party against him and pushed moderates into the arms of radicals. Lincoln, precisely because he was not Johnson, would not have created those same circumstances, which raises the darkest possibility in this entire alternate timeline. A Lincoln Reconstruction moderate, conciliatory, effective enough to avoid the worst, might paradoxically have produced a more stable but less just outcome. The 14th Amendment, which became the constitutional foundation for civil rights law well into the 21st century, might have passed in a weaker form, or not at all. The 15th Amendment, guaranteeing the right to vote regardless of race, might have been delayed by decades. The question, as historians phrase it carefully, is not just whether Lincoln would have done better than Johnson. Almost anyone would have done better than Johnson, but whether Lincoln would have done enough. One veteran who had ridden with the notorious Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, founder of the Ku Klux Klan, was asked decades later about Lincoln. He said that if Lincoln had lived, the South would not have had the horrors of Reconstruction. He considered Lincoln the South's best friend in Washington. An Alabama veteran made the same point even more sharply, saying the assassin's bullet was, in the end, a death blow to the South itself, because it removed the one man powerful enough to protect it from the anger of the victorious North. That is the final twist in this story. The man who killed Lincoln to avenge the South destroyed whatever chance the South had for a genuinely merciful peace. The man who died on the floor of a Washington boarding house might have given both black Americans and white Southerners something neither group ultimately received: a real beginning, instead of 100 more years of pain. History never gave either of them that chance. If Lincoln had lived, do you think Reconstruction would have succeeded? Leave your answer below